I am Vasilios from University College London. This is Snappy, our solution that enables fast on-chain payments with practical collaterals. This is joint work with Karl, Wüst, Aritra, Kari, and Srdjan from ETH Zurich. I was actually happy to hear about Collaterals earlier in the Q&A because our paper has a lot to do with collaterals. So yeah, cryptocurrencies based on permissionless blockchains, they have some potential for actually changing things. We could perhaps decentralize the global financial system in some degree by reducing trust assumptions, increasing the operational transparency of institutions, and perhaps also improving user privacy on our way there. So, but before we can do that, there are several open challenges which have been addressed to different degrees. One of them is throughput, the other one is latency, and we also have privacy. So to put into perspective where we currently are, we will compare with centralized payment processors like Visa, MasterCard, all these companies. So in terms of throughput, Visa and all these companies, they can easily handle thousands of transactions per second, whereas blockchains now, permissionless blockchains, they can do tens of transactions per second. Latency is pretty much very similar. These companies can do confirmation, final confirmation in less than 3 seconds. For blockchains, you still need to wait several minutes to eventual finality. And then privacy, it's a kind of a more positive message there. You have, with centralized payment processors, you trust a third party with all your transactions, basically, whereas with several blockchains, you can have either from no privacy at all, if we're considering Bitcoin or Ethereum, just pseudonymity, or full privacy, we'll consider some others that care more about that. So in this paper, we actually focus on the latency challenge and we approach it in the context of retail payments, purchases, point-of-sale purchases, and in general, time-critical transactions. So there has been, of course, lots of work in all of those three challenges. Latency remains open, and now I'll explain why. So, for example, there is lots of work into improving the consensus protocols and the underlying machinery of blockchains. So you have proof-of-stake consensus or sharding, which allows you to distribute the load of your transactions throughout your network. And all these actually improve significantly the throughput of the blockchain. So if we see, as far as I'm aware, no permissionless blockchains are actually using that unless with some relaxations on the threat model. But when it comes to latency, they actually don't cut it, even those very good ideas. So what happens is you can get better latency, like reduced latency, but this comes under a relaxed threat model. So if you want to keep the original threat model, which is completely trustless, the improvements in latency are completely negligible. So another type of solutions is layer 2 protocols. Very good idea. So since the chain is slow, we move all the transactions off the chain, and we use the blockchain as little as possible, only when necessary for either for synchronization or dispute resolution. And they indeed achieve high throughput and low latency. But again, there are several caveats. For example, you have payment channels, which was one of the first ideas with layer 2 protocols that actually in practice, if you're a customer and you want to be able to use several merchants, you have to lock funds in several channels with them and kind of pre-deposit your future expenditures. And this actually grows very fast, very quickly. There are other solutions that are trying to address this problem, namely payment networks, payment hubs, sidechains. The problem with this is that they're actually quite incompatible with the unilateral nature of payments in retail. Since all the money flow only in one direction, you cannot have rebalancing. And actually, most of them, they introduce additional trust assumptions that essentially account for a relaxation to the original threat model, which we said we actually like and we want to keep. So Snappy does things a bit differently. We care about latency, as we said. We are able to actually approve transactions within 2 seconds in a retail payment scenario. It can operate on top of the existing low throughput, high latency blockchains, but it's also future-proof in the sense that if we ever get high throughput blockchains and high or mid latency blockchains, we can actually also function on top of this and improve their latency in use cases where it makes sense. Now, the key features are we don't make any changes to the underlying consensus protocol. We don't introduce any additional trust assumptions, and we don't have any additional operational requirements like what you would have with watchtowers, if you're familiar with that. Now, there is a small opportunity cost because you need to keep some money locked in, less than what other solutions require, but still. And we require a quite expressive smart contract language. What Solidity for Ethereum would cut it, and a few others as well. So just to kind of give a more detailed description of the application scenarios we're considering, you can think of a setup with several customers, maybe even millions, and a moderate set of recipients, which are essentially shops. It's maybe 100 or maybe a bit more, but not that many. So the users want to pay the recipients, and these payments are usually small to mid-value transactions, and it actually makes sense. If you want to do grocery shopping, you care about latency because you don't want to stay for 3 minutes at the cashier. But then if you're buying a car, it's more or less okay if the payment takes half an hour or an hour, it's okay, it's in one-off, you do it only once. So the recipients actually, as we saw in the previous talk, they won't give the goods unless the transaction has been finalized. So they wait for that before they hand out what the person purchased. Now, how does latency occur? We saw this earlier. It has to do with the block interval, but also with you waiting for several blocks. But the idea is that, well, maybe we could actually accept zero confirmation transactions. Why is it so bad? What could happen is you could have a double spend where you hand out the goods, but you don't get the payment. It was very nicely explained in the previous talk. So you could have also some other trivial solutions that may work in individual cases, convince your supermarket to trust you that you won't double spend on them, pre-deposit all the funds you're going to spend to your supermarket. If you're a huge fan, sure, you can do it. And there is also a nice line of work where I think they use machine learning and they try to predict if an account is about to double spend or if a transaction is suspicious, but this is again probabilistic and relies on a trusted third party. So the idea is, can we do any better than that? And it turns out you can. So you can let the customers keep the money in their own wallet so they don't need to deposit them anywhere else. The merchants are guaranteed to get their money, and we don't rely on third parties. So the first idea, and it was brought up earlier, you could use collaterals. So what you can do is you can ask the customer to place a small amount on a smart contract, and in case they double spend on you as a merchant, you can go to the smart contract, provide proof, and receive the funds from there. Now, to do that, you need to start what we call a settlement claim, where you provide, in Ethereum, for example, conflicting transactions for a double spend, they're going to have the same nonce, which is a monotonically increasing counter. So to double spend, you need to sign 2 transactions with the same counter value. So what the victim merchant can do is you can take the one transaction that you gave to them that promised payment, and then the other transaction that is a double spend that appears on the blockchain, submit this to the smart contract and get their money. Of course, this collateral is never spent if you're not double spending. So it just says they're guaranteeing your transactions essentially forever, or until you withdraw it. The problem with this idea is that it works for one merchant, but once you start scaling it up, it becomes very hard very fast because, the collateral may be enough to cover the transactions with one merchant, but, you may have another merchant, so you essentially triple spend, which means that now the merchants need to find a way to know which other pending transactions you have with other participants in the system. So, and also make sure that what your collateral is enough for all those transactions. So here is an idea. I'm going to present a few of those kind of strawman designs just to see how we ended up with our actual design. So, well, you could have all the customers deposit their collaterals first. Then one of them could go to a merchant and ask to pay. The merchant could actually ask everyone else in the system if they have pending transactions with that customer, and then everyone else can respond to them and tell them if they have any transactions. And then the merchant can decide if the collateral is enough for everyone or not. Now and then the customer sends the payment if that's okay. Well, the drawback of that is that now you assume that all the merchants are trustworthy and that you actually need all of them to be 100% available to answer to these queries. So if one of them is not around, then you start having a problem. A slightly better version that can tolerate some of unavailability is use a side chain, which is essentially a blockchain using a different consensus protocol. The problem is that this introduces additional trust assumptions. For example, if you use BFT consensus, now you assume that, well, all the malicious participants can be up to 1/3, which is completely different from what we started with. Another design is we could have a trusted third party that stands in the middle. Customer has deposited the collateral, right? The first step goes to the merchant, asks to pay. That merchant asks this trusted third party if the pending transactions of that customer have exceeded the collateral or not. If that third party says it's okay, they move ahead with the payment. Well, the problem with this is that, of course, this is a third party. There is lots of money at stake, so they could equivocate, right? Or they could even collude with customers to steal money from merchants. This can be improved by using, again, the idea of collaterals and having that party place collateral. So essentially, you're doing the exact same thing, but now this state-keeping party has also to place a collateral on the smart contract. If a merchant files a claim against a customer that double spent, and then they figure out that, well, there's no money left on the smart contract, they can actually claim the money from the collateral of the state-keeping party. This is somewhat of a solution, but the problem is that still you have a third party that you rely on. You don't trust them with your money, but you rely on for the system, and this means that, well, since they even have to deposit a large amount of money, they will probably charge fees. So can we do any better? So this is actually our design. Our design does not introduce any additional parties, just a smart contract that lives on the blockchain that people deposit money into. So first step, as we saw earlier, customers put money in. Second step, this is now slightly different. The merchants put money into the smart contract, and slightly larger amounts, actually. So what happens is when a customer goes to a merchant and asks to pay, the merchant expects to get from the customer the transactions that are actually currently pending. And what we do is even though Ethereum has a monotonic counter by itself, for technical reasons, we had to introduce our own monotonic counter that you put on the metadata of the transaction so that you can sequence the transactions 1, 2, 3. So the merchant expects to get the pending transactions from the customer before it proceeds. So once it receives those transactions, it knows that, well, this is the amount pending, this is the customer's collateral, so I can move forward or not. So then the next step is actually it asks for approval from the rest of the merchants. The merchants process this query and they return the approval. So the only case where the merchant can proceed with the transaction is only if they receive 50% plus one approvals, at least that much. So what an approval is very different from the approval of the state-keeping third party we had before. The approval says it's a very simple signed statement that says, well, I haven't approved another transaction from that customer with the same index number, and that's all. So the idea is that we want to make sure that when the merchant at the beginning receives a stream of transactions from the customer, this stream of transactions is unique and there is no fake transaction in there. And, well, at the end, if they receive this number of 50% plus one approvals, they can go on with the transaction. So another thing that is different than before is that the payments actually go through the smart contract. This doesn't introduce any latency because this happens actually in one block. It's just for state keeping purposes for the smart contract to know the state of the customer and the merchant. So this actually allow us, this index process that we use to, and this 50% plus one allow us to always have proof when a merchant equivocates so that we can claim money from their collateral. So what happens is if you have one transaction, the green transaction in that case, and you have 5 state keepers, it suffices that 3 of them sign or approve the transaction. Now, if you have another transaction with the same index number, so they are trying to do something sneaky there, you will have at least one state keeper that equivocates, and provably, right? Because you will have that state keeper sign both transactions. And this principle actually, because conflicting transactions come in pairs, scales up to infinite number of transactions. Now, there is an approval protocol. There are many more details there, of course. The interesting thing is that because you have lots of signatures, you cannot put them all on the chain. But what you can do is if you use BLS signatures, you can compress them all or aggregate them all in one. So you just put only one common signature on the chain for the smart contract and everyone else to verify. Our solution actually achieves its goal. So we tested with up to 200 state keepers. This is a non-optimized Python implementation. So if you're a good engineer, you can certainly do better than that. We tested with up to 5,000 transactions per second, and we always got latency less than 1 second. We also promised small collaterals. And the way we achieve that is that actually the collateral covers the expenditure of the customers only for the latency period. This kind of minimizes the size of the money, the amount of money you have to put there. It's just for 3 minutes. So most likely you will have 1 or 2 transactions, but not more. They are reusable. So once the transaction ends up on the blockchain, you can use this collateral to ensure all the transactions. Flexible. Meaning that, well, if the customer can decide how much they put in there, and they are also independent of the number of customers. This goes to the merchant's collaterals. So if you deploy that system and you get lots of hype and billions of customers, potential customers, you don't need to deposit any more collaterals unless this actually significantly increase the business the shops involved get. Takeaways. An honest merchant never loses funds. This is deployable on existing blockchain Ethereum. No additional trust assumptions. The locked funds are not many, and of course, very low latency. Thank you.
Maybe we have time for one quick question. Okay.
Vincent Gramoli, University of Sydney. Thank you for your talk. I didn't get the assumptions that you had. So you rely on the assumption that you can count all the merchants and that this set is static?
So I think I know what you. So the set of merchants that do state keep is actually dynamic, but you need to be very careful with the way this changes, right? So you need to introduce some delays if this is where you're going. So
it's just that if you need 50% of the miners plus 1, then it means that you know exactly what is 100% of them.
Yes, you always know that because they have to put the collaterals, right? So there's going to be a list of them on the blockchain. But this brings up another potential problem because what if another one joins, right? The majority may change. Yeah.
Hi, this is Akash from KU Leuven. Does this work with privacy-preserving blockchains as well, like Zcash and Monero?
So it depends on their smart contract or scripting language. There is actually, this is the next step if you ask my opinion. Anonymity may be a bit confusing there, but I think you could do it with some zero-knowledge proofs if you do it cleverly. So if their smart contract language supports that, which I think Zcash doesn't have one, does it?
No.
That's yeah. For example, the Bitcoin scripting doesn't do it. Ethereum does, and a few more, but yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, interesting talk, but let's keep all other questions for people. Okay. So, yeah, let's thank the speaker.